The morning sun reflected off the glass towers of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where Alexander Rothwell stood in his corner office, 30 floors above the common people. His Italian leather shoes cost more than most made in a month. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the light as he signed another multi-million-dollar contract with barely a glance. At 28, Alexander had inherited an empire worth billions, and he wore that inheritance like armor against the world. But today wasn't about mergers or acquisitions. Today was about impressing Victoria Chen, the brilliant art curator who had somehow agreed to marry him 6 months ago. She stood beside him now, her elegant frame draped in designer silk, as they prepared for what should have been a simple corporate retreat in the Adirondack Mountains. A weekend of luxury camping, they called it glamping for the ultra-wealthy, complete with champagne, caviar, and heated tents that cost more than suburban homes. Enter Marcus Torres. Marcus arrived at the private airfield in a beaten pickup truck that coughed black smoke, disrupting the symphony of purring European engines. His boots were worn through at the edges. His jacket, a faded search and rescue uniform with too many patches and repairs. When he stepped out, Alexander's lip curled in visible disgust. This was their wilderness guide? This man who looked like he'd crawled out from under a bridge? Victoria's reaction was different. Her eyes lit up with recognition she'd read about Marcus Torres. Former Navy SEAL. 23 successful rescues in conditions that would kill most men. The man who'd found a senator's son when every other expert had given up. She extended her hand eagerly, and Marcus took it with callous fingers that told stories of real work, real sacrifice. Alexander noticed. Oh, how he noticed. The way Victoria leaned forward when Marcus explained the terrain. The genuine fascination in her eyes as he showed her his topographical maps, hand-drawn with notes and margins about wind patterns, animal migrations, underground water sources. The smile, that particular smile Alexander thought belonged only to him, spreading across her face as Marcus shared a story about tracking a lost child through a blizzard, using only broken twigs and disturbed snow patterns. The corporate jet lifted them toward the mountains, and inside the luxury cabin, Alexander watched Victoria choose to sit near Marcus instead of in her usual spot. She peppered him with questions about survival, about his experiences, about the psychology of being lost. Marcus answered quietly, humbly, his weathered hands sketching invisible maps in the air. Each gesture made Alexander's jaw clench tighter. At the glamping site, the contrast became unbearable. While Alexander struggled to understand how his satellite phone had lost signal, Marcus was teaching Victoria to read the sky for weather changes. While Alexander complained about the Wi-Fi speed in their luxury tent, Marcus showed Victoria how to identify edible plants growing wild at the camp's edge. While Alexander name-dropped celebrities and politicians, Marcus quietly built a perfect fire with nothing but friction and patience, the flames dancing in Victoria's admiring eyes. The breaking point came during dinner. The catered meal flown in fresh from Les Bernardines sat barely touched as Victoria hung on Marcus's every word about navigation by stars. She asked him to teach her. They stood together outside the dining tent, Marcus's rough hand gently guiding hers to trace constellations, explaining how Polaris had saved his life more times than any GPS ever could. Alexander watched from behind champagne crystal as his fiancée looked at this nobody, this servant, with more genuine interest than she'd shown at their engagement party, surrounded by billionaires. That night, Alexander made his decision. He found Marcus checking equipment for the morning's hike, running weathered fingers over rope coils, testing carabiner gates with practiced precision. The conversation was brief, held in the shadows where no one could witness Alexander's pettiness. A check was written, a massive amount more money than Marcus would see in 5 years. The message was clear: take it and leave now, or be destroyed by lawyers and influence. Marcus looked at the check, then at Alexander's cold eyes, understanding perfectly what kind of man stood before him. Marcus left before dawn, his truck disappearing into morning mist. Victoria found out at breakfast. Alexander spun his web of lies with practiced ease. Marcus had a family emergency. Another guide would arrive soon. Someone better, more professional, more appropriate for their status. But Victoria's face had changed. Something in her eyes dimmed as she nodded slowly, pushing eggs around her plate. They ventured out anyway. Alexander insisted they didn't need a guide for a simple morning hike. The trail was marked. They had GPS devices. What could go wrong in a luxury camping zone where CEOs and senators came to play at being outdoorsy? But mountains don't care about money. The weather turned without warning, exactly as Marcus had predicted it might, based on the pressure changes he'd felt in his bones. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick and suffocating. The trail markers vanished into white nothing. The GPS devices, so dependent on clear signals, spun uselessly in Alexander's increasingly sweaty palms. Victoria tried to stay calm at first. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Then the rain began, ice-cold mountain rain that luxury jackets weren't truly designed to handle. They walked in circles, each tree looking identical to the last, each rock formation a mockery of the previous one. By hour 3, Victoria had stopped responding to Alexander's increasingly panicked calls. She'd wandered off trail while he was fumbling with his dead phone. By hour 4, Alexander was alone, screaming her name into fog that swallowed sound like hunger. His designer boots were filled with mud and blood from blisters. His hands were cut from grabbing at rocks and branches. Night fell like a coffin lid. Back at base camp, the other executives noticed their absence. Search and rescue was called. Professional teams arrived with dogs, drones, thermal imaging equipment. They found Alexander after midnight, hypothermic and sobbing, collapsed beside a stream he'd been following in the wrong direction. But Victoria was gone, vanished into the vastness of the mountains as if she'd never existed. The search expanded. State police, FBI, because of the Rothwell name. Helicopters thundered over ridges. Hundreds of volunteers combed every trail, every possible path. The best tracking experts money could buy were flown in from across the country. Nothing, not a trace. Day 3 arrived with crushing finality. The statistics were clear. After 72 hours in those conditions, without proper gear, survival dropped to near zero. The search coordinators gathered in the command tent, their faces grave. They spoke in hushed tones about recovery operations, about where bodies typically ended up after falls, about how to prepare the family. Alexander sat in the corner of that tent, his empire meaningless, his billions worthless, watching them give up on the only person who'd ever mattered. His perfect appearance was destroyed stubble, hollow eyes, clothes that reeked of failure and fear. He stared at his phone, at the last photo of Victoria, taken just before they'd left for that cursed hike. She was smiling, trusting him completely. The lead coordinator approached with paperwork, forms to sign, authorizations to shift from rescue to recovery. The words blurred through Alexander's tears as he realized what he'd done. In firing Marcus Torres, he'd removed the only person who could read these mountains like scripture, who could track a butterfly through a hurricane. The tent flap opened. Another expert shaking his head. Another failure. Another confirmation that Victoria was beyond reach, lost forever in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Alexander Rothwell, heir to billions, master of boardrooms, destroyer of companies, sat surrounded by the best money could buy, and understood with crystal clarity that he had thrown away the only resource that mattered: his jealousy, his pride, his need to be the only impressive man in Victoria's world. It had killed her. The weight of that knowledge crushed him into his chair as the surge commander officially called off the active rescue, moving to recovery operations only. The news of Victoria Chin's disappearance had traveled fast through the mountain communities. In a small cabin 20 miles away, Marcus Torres set down his coffee as the radio announced the search was being called off. His weathered fingers traced the topographical map spread across his kitchen table, the same map he'd studied 3 nights ago, marking probable shelter spots, water sources, hidden caves that wouldn't show up on any GPS. He'd given Alexander Rothwell what he wanted, taken the check, disappeared. But mountains had taught Marcus about duty, about codes that ran deeper than money. He'd accepted payment to leave, yes, but not to let an innocent woman die. Marcus loaded his truck with gear the official search teams had never considered. An old Native American tracking stick, gifted by an elder who'd taught him to read stories in disturbed grass. Rope made from paracord, lighter but stronger than anything the rescue teams carried. A whistle that mimicked the call of mountain birds because sometimes lost people went silent to humans but still responded to nature. Most importantly, he carried knowledge, where the underground streams created acoustic channels, where the magnetic fields played tricks on compasses, where a person seeking shelter would instinctively go if they had any survival instinct left. He arrived at the search command center as they were packing up. The FBI agents looked through him like he was invisible, just another local gawker. The state police held up hands to turn him away. But one person recognized him, Sarah Mitchell, a veteran search coordinator who'd worked with Marcus before. Her eyes widened. She grabbed his arm, pulled him past the barriers. The command tent erupted in chaos when Marcus entered. Alexander Rothwell's face transformed from despair to rage to fear in 3 heartbeats. He stood, pointed, his voice cracking as he demanded this man be removed. But Sarah was already spreading Marcus's hand-drawn maps over the digital displays, watching him mark patterns nobody else had seen. Marcus ignored Alexander completely. His finger traced lines across elevations, following something invisible to the others. He picked up photos from the drones, held them to the light, noticed shadows that suggested overhangs the imaging software had missed. He studied the weather data from 3 days ago, cross-referenced it with his knowledge of how wind moved through these specific valleys, where it would push someone seeking shelter. Then he asked a simple question that silenced the room. Had anyone checked the old Moonshiner Caves on the north face? Blank stares. The caves weren't on any official map. They'd been dynamited, closed in the 1,960 seconds, except Marcus knew the demolition had been incomplete. He'd found them years ago, tracking a wounded bear. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that only ran during rain. The same rain that had started the day Victoria disappeared. Alexander tried to protest, tried to assert his authority, his money, his influence. But the search professionals were already mobilizing around Marcus. They recognized expertise when they saw it, and every minute mattered now. Sarah thrust a radio into Marcus's hand. The helicopter pilots were given new coordinates. The dog teams were redirected. Marcus moved into the wilderness like he was born from it, where the official teams had used brute force grids, technology, numbers. Marcus read the mountain story. A broken branch at shoulder height, not deer height. Moss disturbed on only north-facing rocks, suggesting someone moving without compass knowledge. A particular pattern in mud that looked like designer boot treads, not hiking boots. He found her scarf first, not torn on a branch like an accident, but tied deliberately. Victoria had been leaving markers, just not ones the search teams recognized. She'd remembered his lesson about using fabric to mark direction. The scarf pointed northwest, toward the hidden caves. The waterfall was roaring from 3 days of accumulated rain. Behind it, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was darkness. Marcus rappelled down, his headlamp cutting through shadows that hadn't seen light in decades. The cave system branched into 3 passages. 2 led nowhere. But from the third came something that made his heart race. The sound of dripping water in a pattern too regular to be natural. Victoria was there. Unconscious, but alive. Her body curled beneath her designer jacket, which she'd ingeniously converted into a moisture trap, collecting water drops in a depression she'd made with rocks. Her ankle was clearly broken, wrapped in strips torn from her undershirt. She'd survived on cave water and the energy bars she'd hidden in her pockets after Marcus had warned her to always carry emergency supplies, no matter how short the hike seemed. The radio crackled with static in the cave, but Marcus's emergency whistle carried. The sound bounced through the acoustic channels he knew existed, reaching the search teams above. Within minutes, the rescue operation transformed from recovery to revival. Helicopters converged, medical teams prepared. The best trauma doctors in the state were already being flown in. Marcus carried Victoria out himself, through the waterfall, up the cliff face, his muscles remembering every hold, every safe path. The search teams watched in awe as this dismissed, discarded guide emerged from terrain they'd declared impossible, carrying the woman they'd declared dead. But the story didn't end with rescue. In the medical tent, as Victoria's eyes fluttered open, as oxygen returned color to her cheeks, her first word wasn't Alexander's name. It was Marcus. Her hand reached out, gripped his weathered fingers, and she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You came back. He sent you away, but you came back." The tent went silent. Every eye turned to Alexander Rothwell. Sarah Mitchell, the search coordinator, stepped forward. Her voice was professional but cold as Arctic stone. She asked Victoria to repeat what she'd said. Victoria, growing stronger with each breath, told the truth. How Alexander had been jealous, how Marcus had disappeared overnight, how Alexander had lied about the family emergency. The FBI agents exchanged glances, reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, interfering with rescue operations by dismissing qualified personnel. The charges would be complex, but the evidence was overwhelming. The check Alexander had written to Marcus produced it now, uncashed, still in his wallet, proof of the bribe, proof of the jealousy that had nearly killed Victoria Chen. The news crews, held back until now, were released by Sarah herself. The story exploded across channels, across social media, across the world. Billionaire's jealousy nearly kills fiancé. Fired hero guide saves woman after paid experts fail. The price of pride, how ego almost became murder. Marcus tried to fade back, to disappear as he always did after a rescue, but Victoria wouldn't let go of his hand. Even as the medical helicopter prepared to evacuate her to the trauma center, she insisted he come along. Alexander tried to follow, tried to claim his place as her fiancé, but Victoria's words cut through the rotor noise. "No, you're nothing to me now." The engagement ring, that 4-carat statement of possession, was removed by nurses and handed back to Alexander without ceremony. In the weeks that followed, the empire began to crumble. Investors fled from a man whose judgment was so catastrophically flawed. Board members demanded resignation. The Rothwell name, once synonymous with power, became shorthand for toxic pride. Alexander's lawyers kept him out of prison, barely, but couldn't save him from the civil suits, the social exile, the complete destruction of everything he'd inherited but never earned. Marcus returned to his cabin, to his maps, to his mountains. But something had changed. A new truck appeared in his driveway, not luxury, but solid, reliable, paid for by a crowdfunding campaign that raised $2 million in 3 days. Job offers flooded in from real rescue organizations, from governments, from agencies that recognized what genuine expertise looked like. And on quiet evenings, a familiar car would arrive at his cabin. Victoria Chen, walking now with only a slight limp, bringing coffee and conversation. She was learning to read the mountains properly this time, learning from someone who understood that true worth wasn't measured in dollars or degrees, but in the lives you could save when everything else failed. The final scene was captured by a photographer hiking the trails 6 months later. It showed 2 figures on a mountain peak at sunrise. Marcus Torres, standing solid and sure, and beside him, Victoria Chen, no longer draped in designer clothes but in practical gear, her hand in his weathered one. In the background, barely visible in morning mist, the ruins of the glamping site where Alexander Rothwell had lost everything to jealousy. The mountains had delivered their judgment. The humble expert had proven his worth. And the heir, who had everything but valued nothing, sat alone in an empty office, his empire reduced to echoes, understanding finally that some things, competence, character, Genuine connection couldn't be bought, sold, or stolen. They could only be earned.